What if the man who's always been the rock for everyone else finally cracks, alone on a farm where winter never ends? On the edge of a forgotten Nebraska farm, a man who spent a lifetime holding everyone else together stands face to face with his own breaking point. When a half-wild, starving horse appears in the winter fog, what follows is not a rescue, but a slow unraveling, a journey through loneliness, fear, and the smallest, bravest acts of healing. This isn't a story about victory. It's about daring to be gentle when the world turns hard, and discovering that, sometimes, choosing to stay is the bravest thing of all. Wind dragged across the open land, flattening the brittle weeds left standing through the freeze, dragging ribbons of gray cloud across a sky the color of steel. In Nebraska, March wasn't a promise. It was a hesitation. The snow had begun to recede, not in drifts but in sullen patches, bearing mud the color of old coffee grounds. Jonas Miles, heavyset but slightly stooped now, shouldered his way into the day before dawn, boots thick with yesterday's dirt. The horizon was barely a rumor, the cold so sharp it felt like a punishment for those who dared to get up before the sun. He moved through the old barn with the practiced choreography of someone who'd done it alone too many years. The boards creaked, complaining under his weight. His hands, broad, rope-burned, with knuckles swollen from a lifetime of winter, scattered flakes of hay into empty stalls. The sound of the pitchfork scraping along concrete, the heavy thunk as he heaved it into the corner, echoed in the chilly quiet. Jonas didn't speak to the animals, not anymore. There were only 3 cows, 2 older hens who'd outlived their laying years, and a dog who mostly slept by the stove now. The animals expected little, so he gave them what he had, routine, sustenance, and a certain hard gentleness. He paused at the barn door, staring out over the fields. The world looked unfinished, as if the snow hadn't known whether to leave or stay. Here and there, puddles reflected the pewter sky. The wind snapped at the battered windmill near the edge of the property, rattling it in a way that sounded almost like laughter. Jonas drew his coat tighter, pulling the collar up until it pressed against his chin. His breath puffed out in heavy, reluctant clouds. There was nothing particularly remarkable about this morning. Nothing to separate it from the long line of mornings before. That was the point. Sameness was a kind of comfort, a lullaby for the parts of himself he refused to examine. There had been a time when he'd been a center of gravity for others. His wife, his son, neighbors who came for advice, a tool, a borrowed hand. He'd shouldered their grief, their uncertainty, and their needs. He'd always kept his own pain neatly folded, tucked away like a letter in a drawer no one else opened. But that drawer had grown heavy. These days, he felt it every time he bent to tie his boots, every time his fingers stiffened around the handle of the pitchfork, every time he found himself reaching for something, a voice, a memory, a shape beside him in bed, and finding nothing but empty air. He didn't let himself pause for long, afraid that the silence would leak into him, swelling until it cracked whatever held him together. The house, a squat white shape up the hill, waited for him. Its paint had begun to peel. He passed by the side window, catching his own reflection, a face grayer than he remembered, eyes sharp but tired, jaw set like a stone. Jonas kept moving. He carried water for the stock, stacking the buckets by the barn. His breath fogged the surface, then vanished. After chores, he found himself drawn toward the south fence. The wind funneled through the gap in the trees, stinging his cheeks. He stopped, sensing something different, an absence in the landscape, a wrong note in the familiar morning song. He squinted, hand shielding his eyes from the sting of the wind. and saw nothing at first. Then, in the field beyond the last fence, he caught the outline, a huddled, unmoving shape. The color was almost indistinguishable from the mud, but as his eyes adjusted, Jonas felt a thud in his chest. It was too large for a stray dog, too solitary for a deer. It didn't move even as the wind tore at its outline. He stood there a long moment, heart beating slow and deliberate, as if considering whether to care or not. Habit warred with something older, a half-buried tenderness, a memory of soft words and gentle hands from a different lifetime. He closed his eyes against the bite of the wind, letting himself shiver. He almost turned back, told himself it was nothing, just an old log or a leftover shadow. But the morning was too quiet, the world too empty for him to leave it that way. He was tired, tired of being strong, tired of pretending the silence was all he needed. Something inside him, something brittle, gave way. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The sound of it surprised him, softer than he meant, almost like a sigh. Jonas stepped forward, boots sucking at the wet earth. The air around him was sharp and wet, thick with the metallic scent of melting snow, a hint of manure, the trace of something wild and uncertain. He stopped just inside the fence, both hands gripping the splintered post. His shoulders, which had been braced against the world all morning, finally fell. For a moment, he let himself simply look at the emptiness, the loneliness, and the possibility of something else, even if it was just a stray animal and a broken fence. In the fragile hush between gusts of wind, Jonas felt his own facade quiver. The day, the field, the smallness of his world. Suddenly, it pressed in on him, and the old hurt, the one he never named, rose up sharp as a blade behind his ribs. He blinked hard, jaw clenching, as if he could hold it all inside a little longer. But the shape out there didn't move. The world didn't offer explanations. Jonas found himself wishing, just for a moment, that someone would come looking for him, that someone would see him standing there, wind-whipped and tired, and know how heavy it all had become. He was always the last one standing, the strong one, the one who never cried. Now he just stood in the cold, watching the brown shape on the horizon, and felt the first hairline crack in his own resolve. The wind picked up, rattling the dry grass, scouring the last traces of pride from his face. And in that thin, trembling silence, Jonas Miles let himself hurt. He stayed like that, unmoving, until the sky began to brighten just slightly at the edges, a warning that another day would soon begin, indifferent to his grief or anyone else's. Still, for once, Jonas didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it settle around him, heavy and true, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt the honest ache of wanting, not just to endure, but to be seen, even if only by a shadow in the snow. The wind had a different bite when Jonas stepped back out, this time with the weight of decision humming in his blood. He paused on the porch, slid his arms into his old canvas jacket, and drew the zipper up as high as it would go. The air felt heavier than before, saturated with the hush that comes only after a long season of loss. Every step across the yard was a reminder. Mud sucking at his boots, the crunch of last autumn's dead grass, the deep, uncertain pull of another day. He crossed the farmyard with the steady gait of a man used to doing things alone. There was no reason for urgency. Nothing on this land ran except the clock and the wind, but his heart stumbled against a memory. The mornings he used to walk out with a small hand pressed in his son's questions bubbling, his wife humming low inside the house, a pan clattering, the pulse of family life that had drifted away like smoke. At the fence, Jonas paused, one gloved hand resting on the old iron gate. He looked up and down the line, as if expecting someone else to materialize. Someone more capable, less tired. No one came. The air was a mix of melting frost and the iron tang of rust, with an undertone of something sour that never quite left after the winter. Out in the field, the brown shape still huddled against the battered wire. A horse, he realized now, its outline clearer in the thinning mist. The animal's coat was matted, the color of muddy riverbank, fur caked with old snow and dried mud. It was a thin animal, bony along the hips, legs tucked awkwardly, ribs sharp and unmistakable. The sight hit Jonas with an ache that was both familiar and new, a reminder of all the things in life left out in the weather, expected to survive. He stood for a while, letting the wind and silence wash over him. The horse didn't look up, didn't shift, only the faintest tremble in its flanks betraying life. Jonas reached into his jacket pocket, feeling around until he found a small, wrinkled carrot, left over perhaps from yesterday's stew. He turned it in his palm, thumbed the dirt away, and held it out for a moment, studying its ordinary shape. Crossing the fence wasn't dramatic, just the scrape of denim on old wood, a grunt as he swung one leg, then the other, into the soft, churned-up earth beyond. The world seemed smaller on this side, the house farther away, the road a distant idea. Jonas crouched a good 10 paces from the horse, boots flattening the brittle grass. He set the carrot down carefully, letting it roll from his palm into the gray-brown tangle at his feet. He didn't speak. The language for this moment wasn't words. It was the way he eased himself down to sit, slow and careful, knees pulled in close, elbows on thighs. He watched, breathing quietly, letting the animal's fear settle. There was no need to force trust. He had learned, through hard years and harder silence, that trust was a plant that grew only if you didn't look at it too closely, didn't tug at its fragile roots. Minutes passed, measured not by clocks, but by the slow warming of the air, the shift of the horse's ears. Jonas kept his eyes low, not staring, not demanding. He let himself become another part of the landscape, a post, a rock, a man with nothing left to prove. He knew what it was to be watched with suspicion, to want distance, to have nothing left to give except presence. The horse flicked an ear, turned its head the barest inch. Its eyes were wide, glossy, and ringed with dirt. Jonas saw a raw fear there, the kind born of long neglect, and something else, something like endurance. He let the silence fill the space between them, aware of every sound, a crow calling somewhere over the barn, the distant bark of his old dog, the wind combing through last year's cornstalks. Jonas didn't speak. Instead, he tugged off one glove, letting the cold settle into his knuckles, and set his hand palm up on the earth between them. He sat with that gesture, unmoving, open, a question without pressure. Time lengthened. A cloud shifted overhead, letting a blade of sunlight pass, pale and uncertain. The light struck the horse's coat, revealing a patch of old scars along its side, white against the brown. Jonas's chest tightened. He thought of his own scars, the ones he kept hidden beneath flannel and silence, the places he didn't let anyone touch. After a long while, the horse stretched its neck, nostrils flaring toward the scent of carrot. Every movement was deliberate, as if weighing the risk of each inch. Jonas held his breath, feeling his own pulse flutter at the base of his throat. The animal stopped just short, lowering its head, muscles trembling. For a moment it looked at him, really looked, as if searching for an answer to an old question. Jonas blinked, and something behind his eyes stung. He thought, absurdly, of his father teaching him to approach a frightened animal. Don't rush, don't grab, just be there. Just let them know you're not going anywhere. He stayed like that, hand on the earth, eyes soft, breath clouding in the air. The horse didn't touch the carrot. But it didn't turn away either. The space between them was filled with waiting, a quiet so deep it seemed to hold both their griefs, layered and old, given shape by winter and loss. Finally, as the sun crept higher and the wind eased, Jonas rose to his feet, careful not to startle. He left the carrot where it was, brushed the dirt from his hands, and retreated the way he'd come, boots squelching through the mud. He paused at the fence line, looked back once and found the horse watching him, eyes wide and uncertain, but no longer empty. He stood for a moment, letting the new ache settle, then turned toward home, the carrot and the promise of patience left behind him. There would be time. For now he had given what he could, a gentle offering, a small space for trust to breathe. The rest, as always, would depend on waiting. Dawn broke softer the next morning, as if the world itself was weary of cold. A low mist crept from the creek and clung to the bare willow branches, shrouding the edges of Jonas's land in a kind of hush. The routine was unchanged. Kettle on the stove, coffee measured and poured, the familiar scent swirling through the kitchen as Jonas waited by the window, his hand wrapped tight around a chipped mug. He watched the field with a practiced eye, searching for that brown shape in the gray. It was still there, further from the fence now, body curled into itself, head lowered against the wind. Jonas let the coffee cool on his tongue, the warmth slow to reach his chest. He finished the cup, set it in the sink, and pulled on his boots with a sigh that fogged the cold glass. He filled a bucket with clean water, gathered a handful of last year's oats from the bin, rations for a guest that hadn't yet accepted the invitation. The sun, reluctant and pale, dragged its way above the horizon as Jonas made his way down the path. His breath lingered behind him, white and fleeting. No words were spoken as he moved along the fence line, carrying his quiet offering. He placed the water and oats a short distance from where the horse lay, then stepped back, settling onto a low rock, hands clasped between his knees. There was no need to hurry. Time, for once, was an ally. The horse did not rise, but its ears twitched as Jonas sat, the only movement in a landscape otherwise stilled by frost. Jonas did not stare. He kept his gaze low, letting his shoulders drop, body soft and unthreatening. He knew what it meant to need space. He remembered the nights, too many, when the house was too silent, the ache in his chest too sharp, and all he wanted was for someone to simply sit nearby and not speak. A crow called in the distance. The day wore on in increments, a shadow crossing the yard, the slow drip of melting ice from the barn eaves, the bark of a dog from inside the house. Jonas waited until the chill began to bite through his coat, then rose, dusted his hands, and walked back the way he'd come, leaving the food and water untouched behind him. The next morning, the oats were gone. The water was muddy, the bucket knocked askew. Jonas felt a pulse of something, relief or hope, it was hard to tell. He refilled the bucket, left another measure of oats, and again took his place, silent, distant, steadfast. So the pattern set itself, stretching into days. Jonas would approach at dawn and dusk, always with some small gesture, a few carrots, a handful of hay, sometimes just his presence. The horse, cautious at first, began to shift closer, hunger and curiosity slowly overcoming fear. There were setbacks, a snapped twig sending the animal skittering away, a sudden gust of wind making it bolt to the far edge of the field. Each time Jonas stayed gentle. He never raised his voice, never reached out too soon. Late one afternoon, as the sun slanted gold across the muddied pasture, Jonas saw the horse watching him, eyes dark and deep. The air was warmer now, edged with the scent of thawing earth. Jonas sat on the ground, knees drawn up, and let the animal draw near at its own pace. He stayed motionless as a shadow, hands open and empty on his knees. He let the hush between them thicken, becoming almost a kind of shelter. It happened quietly, as most important things do. The horse stepped forward, one uncertain hoof, then another. Jonas could see every tremor in the animal's slender legs, every flick of its ears. He held his breath, chest tight, afraid to break the spell. The horse stopped just beyond his reach, lowered its head, and sniffed at the empty air between them. Jonas blinked and felt a sudden sting in his eyes, a longing so old he hardly recognized it, the longing to be trusted again. He let his hand drift slowly out, palm up, fingers slack. The horse didn't flinch. Its muzzle hovered, close enough that Jonas could feel the heat of its breath on his skin, a damp, grassy scent, the simple truth of animal life. They stayed that way a long moment, neither moving, bound by a silence that felt both fragile and profound. That evening, Jonas returned to the barn, hands shaking in the softening light. He sat on the floor near the open stall, listening to the creak of the rafters, the low rustle of straw. He let his head fall into his hands, not crying, not quite. The ache in his chest pressed close. But this time it did not hollow him out. Instead, it seemed to fill him, like the hush of the field, or the warmth left behind after a hard winter. He thought of his wife, of the way she used to sit on the porch and hum when the world got too heavy. He remembered his son's small hand, the trust in that grip. He thought of all the nights he had sat in this same barn, pretending not to feel the weight, holding it so tightly his shoulders ached. He realized, sitting there, that he could not be the strong one forever, not for himself, not for anyone. The world asked only for patience, a little kindness, and the willingness to stay. The light faded. Somewhere outside, the horse grazed, untangling the fear from its own memory. Jonas stayed until the cold drove him inside, then stood at the barn door, watching the field go dark. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the slow, uncertain beat, and knew something had shifted. Not everything needed to be mended all at once. Some wounds closed in silence, some trust returned, shy and unsteady, in the smallest of gestures. By the time the ground thawed enough for mud to swallow Jonas's boots, the brown horse was no longer a distant shape at the fence. Now she lingered by the old gate most mornings and stood in the shadow of the barn in the evenings, never pressing too close, but never vanishing into the fields the way she had at first. Jonas noticed her footprints, 2 parallel tracks pressed into the yielding earth, leading from the hedgerow to the barn, back and forth day after day. His own routines shifted, almost without his knowing. One night, he took the battered flashlight from its nail by the door and made his way out to the old shed, his breath shivering in the cold air. He hauled out a rusted wheelbarrow and spent a quiet hour clearing the abandoned stall, scooping out sodden straw, airing the space, laying down a thick layer of sweet hay carried from last summer's harvest. He worked slowly, sleeves rolled, not hurrying. Dust rose in sunbeams from a cracked window, turning the air to gold for a moment. Every motion seemed to ask forgiveness for having given up on this place, for letting it fall so quiet. Jonas dragged out a blanket from the house, old wool, threadbare in places but still warm. It used to sit on the back of the couch, a soft island during the evenings when the world was too loud. He folded it gently over his arm and brought it out to the stall, draping it across the center beam, then paused. The barn was a hush of wood and dust and the distant lowing of cows. He stood there a long moment, hands resting on the ledge, before stepping back out into the dusk. Hazel, the name didn't come yet, not aloud, stood a little way off, her outline almost blending with the faded boards of the barn. Jonas's hands trembled, but not from cold. He walked toward her, slow and patient. She flicked an ear, but didn't retreat. He kept his eyes low, voice a murmur, body language a promise. I won't ask for what you're not ready to give. That evening, a soft rain fell, tapping on the tin roof with a patient rhythm. Jonas sat just inside the barn, knees bent, elbows on his thighs, his back against the old wooden wall. The air was warm with the scent of straw and horse and the faint perfume of wet grass. Hazel remained at the threshold, her nose inches from the dark earth, mane tangled and shining with rain. Jonas reached for the blanket and, after a pause that stretched out, full of old doubts, he held it out. He let Hazel approach at her own pace, heart clattering in his chest as she drew near enough to sniff the wool, her breath clouding softly in the barn's lamplight. He waited, not moving, the ache in his chest opening a little wider. She didn't spook, didn't turn away. Her side brushed his knee, tentative and fleeting, as if she was testing not just him, but the very idea of comfort. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, careful and slow. His hand lingered on her back, a tremor passing through his fingers, the same tremor that sometimes woke him in the night, some memory of loss or longing shaking loose. He kept the touch feather-light, no more pressure than falling dust. In that hush, Jonas found himself whispering, voice so low it nearly vanished under the rain, Hazel. The name surprised him, gentle, new, as if it had always belonged to her. Hazel's ears flicked, her head tilting toward him. It wasn't recognition, not really, but something close. The name settled between them, a fragile truce. The stall wasn't grand or new, but it was enough. Jonas spread the last of the hay into a thick bed, set a shallow bucket of clean water by the post, and scattered oats in a wide dish. Hazel hesitated at the doorway, neck stretched, hooves rooted in the soft earth, then stepped inside. One careful hoof, then another. The barn seemed to exhale, as if relieved to be useful again. Jonas sat with her as the evening wore down, back pressed to the stall wall, the old lamp throwing a pool of amber across the floor. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Hazel circled the stall twice, sniffed the corners, and finally settled in the hay, knees folding awkwardly as she lay down for the first time under a real roof. Jonas felt the moment as a kind of victory. No triumph, no fanfare, just the simple, shivering gift of trust earned one silent day at a time. He listened to the rhythm of Hazel's breathing, the rain whispering on the roof, the steady ticking of his old watch in his pocket. There was comfort in this. Two creatures shaped by old sorrows, sharing a shelter made not of strength, but of gentle persistence. Later, as the lamp burned low, Jonas leaned his head back and closed his eyes, exhaustion slipping into his bones. Hazel's breath, slow and steady, filled the silence. Outside, the world washed itself clean under the rain. Inside, a tired man and a battered horse made a kind of fragile peace. The walls still remembered laughter and music and the clatter of a young boy's feet. Now they held a new story, one of brokenness and shelter, of showing up again and again for what is left behind. Hazel dozed, her ribs rising and falling, the old blanket warm on her back. Jonas watched her, something unspoken moving in his chest. He let himself stay there, not needing to be anything but present, letting his defenses drop in the quiet. The rain eased. Night crept across the farm. For once, Jonas didn't hurry to fill the emptiness. He stayed beside Hazel until the world outside the barn faded into gentle, healing dark. The days slipped past, quietly as the spring thaw. Time inched forward with the patience of old wood warping under the sun, neither rushed nor wasted, marked only by the subtle rearrangements of habit that made the silence less empty. Jonas's mornings had a new ritual now, threaded through with the steady presence of Hazel. She was there, a brown shadow against the faded boards, before the sun could climb high enough to silver the dew on the grass. Most mornings began the same. Jonas would shuffle to the stove, set the battered kettle on the flame, and spoon out enough coffee for 2 mugs, though only one was ever filled. He moved through the kitchen with slow precision, savoring the scrape of chair legs, the muted thud of his boots, the soft crinkle of the newspaper he retrieved from the porch. As the coffee brewed, he'd glance out the window, and there Hazel would be, framed by mist or sun, sometimes nosing at the kitchen door, sometimes standing quietly beneath the eaves, waiting. He found a peculiar comfort in these repetitions. There was the matter-of-fact way Hazel approached, always cautious, never insistent, a living echo of his own guarded nature. On some mornings, he'd open the kitchen door, step onto the porch, and lean against the chipped white railing with his mug warming his palms. Hazel would drift closer, nostrils flaring at the bitter scent of coffee, eyes soft, patient, curious. She never asked for more than a moment, a shared breath in the new day's light. After coffee, Jonas moved through chores with Hazel in tow, a quiet shadow following his every step. He mucked the stalls, scattered fresh straw, checked fences along the far fields. Hazel followed at her own pace, sometimes stopping to paw the ground or investigate an overturned bucket, her curiosity gentle and unhurried. Jonas learned her habits, her small preferences, the way she lingered by the wild rose bush near the gate, the way she dipped her nose into the creek, savoring the cold water. Each afternoon, after the work was done and the sun had begun to settle westward, Jonas would fetch his old wooden stool and sit outside the barn, a faded paperback splayed open in his lap. Hazel grazed in the yard, sometimes wandering close enough to nuzzle his shoulder or rest her chin on his knee. The silence between them was never awkward, never expectant. Jonas rarely spoke. If he did, it was just a word or two. Hazel's name, a low hum, a quiet greeting to the wind. He found himself reading less and watching more. The steady sway of Hazel's tail, the twitch of her ears, the way her coat caught the sun and shimmered in copper and gold. He noticed, too, the old scars along her flank and the unevenness of her gait on cold mornings, a limp that smoothed out as the day warmed. He recognized his own scars in her, the kind that faded on the surface but sometimes ached deep on days when the air was heavy with memory. Hazel came to trust him enough to allow small caretaking rituals. Every week or so, Jonas would sit in the barn, a box of brushes and a farrier's rasp at his side, and tend to Hazel's hooves. It was slow work, careful and deliberate. Sometimes Hazel would flinch, muscles quivering, as the rasp slid across the toughened edge of her hoof. Jonas was patient. He spoke only with his hands, moving slowly, pausing when she tensed. Their breaths synchronized in those moments, both of them holding the hush steady, waiting for the other to exhale. Jonas noticed the similarities between them. Hazel's hoof, chipped and rough at the edges, mirrored the calluses and nicks on his own hands. The old scar across his knuckle, a remnant from a splintered fence post years ago, brushed sometimes against Hazel's cracked hoof. The barn filled with the sounds of small repair, rasping, brushing, the steady, rhythmic sigh of two bodies learning, little by little, to trust the touch of another. Evenings brought another pattern. Jonas would linger by the barn, sometimes reading old letters by lantern light, sometimes simply sitting. Hazel's head resting on his knee, the two of them half dozing to the sound of insects tuning up in the grass. Some nights he'd pull out the battered radio and tune it low to a country station, letting the soft ache of a fiddle or the gentle pluck of a guitar fill the gaps where words couldn't go. Hazel seemed to listen too, her ears flicking in time to the distant music. Their life together was not extraordinary. The farm didn't prosper, bills still arrived in their unrelenting way, and some nights the loneliness pressed in with a stubborn, familiar weight. But the emptiness no longer felt like defeat. Instead, it had become a space that could be shared, softened by the presence of another living soul. Jonas found that he didn't have to fill the silence. He only had to keep showing up inside it. One afternoon, as Jonas clipped Hazel's mane in the last of the spring sunlight, he felt a sudden urge to weep, a grief so old and so quiet he nearly mistook it for peace. Hazel shifted, pressing her head into his chest, and Jonas let his hand rest in her tangled mane, breathing slow, letting the ache be what it was. Not absence, but the memory of care, the evidence of healing underway. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Hazel blinked, eyes half closed in contentment, and the evening drifted on, one small habit at a time. Two lives stitched quietly back together by routine, patience, and the gentle work of staying. It began as a subtle shift, one of those quiet, offhand things a person almost misses if they aren't paying attention. That morning, Jonas noticed Hazel standing apart from her usual grazing spot, legs stiff, her head lowered, nose barely brushing the wet grass. He poured her oats into the shallow dish by the barn, but she only glanced at it, eyes dull, then looked away. The air held the thick, green promise of a spring thunderstorm. Jonas felt a faint unease crawl beneath his ribs, an old animal warning honed by years of loss. Something wasn't right. He went about his chores, but kept glancing back to where Hazel stood motionless under the cottonwood, the breeze barely stirring her tangled mane. She didn't wander over when he whistled. She didn't lift her head at the sound of his voice. By mid-afternoon, he found her lying in the shade, sides moving with shallow, labored breaths. The sight struck him with a cold, leaden clarity. He knelt beside her, hands trembling, trying to recall everything he'd ever learned about tending the sick or the broken. The old routines, the ones he clung to in the wake of his wife's illness and his son's silence, rose to the surface. He fetched water, checked Hazel's temperature with the back of his calloused hand, ran his palm down her legs and across her chest, searching for some obvious wound. There was none. He thought about calling Doc Bell from the next town over, but his fingers paused over the phone, hesitating. The farm was 2 hours from the nearest vet. The roads were rutted from the thaw and last week's rain. So Jonas did the only thing left. He sat with her, Bunning crept in, filling the barn with shadows. Hazel's breathing slowed but never quite steadied. Jonas moved a bale of hay close, spread the old wool blanket over her body, and settled beside her. His back pressed to the rough boards, his knees drawn up, his arms folded tightly across his chest as if to keep himself from coming apart. He listened to the faint tick of the old wall clock, the steady drip of rainwater from the eaves, the far-off rumble of thunder. His mind kept looping back, over all the times he had tried to hold a family together by sheer force of will, by keeping the world in order, by not letting anyone see how much it hurt. He remembered his wife's final weeks, how he'd stayed up every night in the worn blue chair, holding her hand, promising in silence that he'd be strong for both of them, even as her grip loosened and the world grew quieter with each passing day. He thought of his son's bedroom, empty for years now, the lines of sunlight catching dust on a desk still cluttered with schoolbooks. He remembered the hollow mornings after the funeral, when the silence in the kitchen pressed in so heavy it felt like a living thing. He had believed it was his duty not to break, not to let grief unravel the fabric of their lives. Now, in the darkness of the barn, Jonas felt the cost of that bargain. He watched Hazel's side rise and fall, the movement barely perceptible beneath the blanket. He let his hand rest lightly on her neck, feeling for the pulse that told him she was still there. His thumb traced the shape of her jaw, the softness behind her ear. Every so often, her ears flickered or her eye rolled back toward him, heavy with pain. But she did not try to move away. Time stretched and blurred. The world beyond the barn faded to a hush of wind and rain. Jonas kept watch, letting the tears he'd swallowed for so long slide, silent and warm, down his face. He didn't wipe them away. There was no one left to see, and nothing left to prove. He was just a man, hollowed out by the weight of carrying others, sitting in the dark with a suffering friend. As midnight slipped past, the barn filled with the mingled scents of damp straw and fear. The old blanket he'd used for comfort so many nights was now wrapped around Hazel, absorbing the heat of her struggle, the way a parent absorbs a child's fever or a partner shares the last fragile warmth of a shared bed. Jonas whispered nothing. Words were useless here, brittle as the dry husks of last summer's corn. He only pressed his palm to Hazel's trembling side and kept breathing. He drifted in and out of half-sleep, waking each time Hazel stirred or shifted. Each time he reached for her, the gesture as instinctive as breath. Each time he was met with a fragile but unmistakable will to keep going. A twitch of her ear, a faint sigh, the smallest response. He realized, somewhere between waking and dreaming, that staying was all he could do. He could not fix what was broken, could not turn back time, could not shield Hazel or himself from the reality of pain. But he could bear witness. He could hold her through the night, refusing to abandon her as so many things in his life had abandoned him. When dawn finally grayed the edges of the barn, Jonas was still there, tired, unshaven, hunched over with his hand resting on Hazel's shoulder. She was breathing more evenly, her eyes bright with exhaustion, but alive. Jonas let out a shaky sigh, something old and brittle inside him, cracking wide open. He pressed his forehead to Hazel's mane, closed his eyes, and allowed the tears to come, real, aching, and utterly honest. For the first time in years, he wasn't the strong one. He was just present. And in the hush that followed, as the sun touched the wet fields outside, Jonas understood what it meant to be needed, and to need in return. Morning came gently, not with a blaze but a gradual unfurling, a pale gold that crept through the barn window and painted everything in soft light. Jonas stirred, a stiffness in his bones that felt ancient. the ache of a body that had spent too many hours folded into itself on cold, hard ground. He woke to the sound of Hazel's breathing, no longer thin and ragged, but slow, rhythmic, and strong enough that for a brief moment he doubted it could be real. He sat up, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand, blinking away the traces of sleep and last night's tears. The world was washed clean, the air fresh with the scent of wet hay and the faint green sharpness of spring. He reached for Hazel, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the fragile hope that things might finally turn for the better. Hazel was already watching him. Her eyes, dull and glazed only hours before, were clear now, the dark brown deep and alive. She lifted her head, slow but deliberate, and nudged Jonas's arm with her nose. It was a gentle gesture, nothing showy, but in it was the quiet miracle of survival, a question answered in the silent language of trust. Jonas let his hand drift along her neck, feeling the rise and fall of her breath, the warm solidity of her body beneath the old wool blanket. He whispered her name, Hazel, just once, the word rising from his chest like a song he hadn't sung in years. Hazel responded not with sound, but with presence, a long, exhaled sigh and a soft touch of her brow against his shoulder. He sat with her as the morning unspooled. Sunlight filtered through a gap in the barn wall, catching motes of dust that drifted, aimless and golden. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that shimmered with the promise of new grass. Jonas watched Hazel stretch her legs, testing them with care. And then, slow, tentative, she rose to stand. He did not urge her, did not coax. He only watched, the relief sharp and sudden as the breaking of a fever. For the first time in a long while, Jonas did not feel hollowed out by worry. He stood too, shaking out his stiff limbs, and opened the barn doors wide. Light poured in, spilling over the threshold and pooling on the packed dirt floor. Hazel blinked in the brightness, head high, ears pricked. She took a cautious step forward, then another, until she stood in the doorway with Jonas at her side. Together they stepped into a world made new by morning. The fields beyond the barn were waking, greener than he remembered, alive with the wild music of birds, the hum of waking insects, and the faint, faraway sound of water running through the ditch. Jonas led Hazel to the gate, unlatched it with careful hands, and let her wander free. She did not bolt. Instead, she moved through the yard with the slow assurance of one relearning what it means to belong. Her hooves pressed soft divots into the wet earth. She bent to graze, lips finding the first tender shoots of clover. Jonas watched her, arms crossed against his chest, feeling the old tension in his shoulders slowly release. He walked beside her for a while, not speaking, not directing, just sharing the gentle hush of the day. His hand found her mane, a rich, tangled brown alive with the sun, and for a moment he let himself rest in the steady, rhythmic motion of stroking it smooth. The connection was simple, physical, grounding. A man and a horse, both marked by loss, both remade by the silent insistence of hope. The world outside the farm remained unchanged. Bills unpaid, fences needing mending, the old truck coughing into life only after 3 tries. But inside Jonas, something fundamental had shifted. Where emptiness had taken root, there was now a steady hum of gratitude. Where fear had grown wild and unchecked, there was instead the small, persistent bloom of relief. That evening, as dusk painted the fields in blue and silver, Jonas sat on the porch and watched Hazel wander the yard. He let himself be still, listening to the slow chorus of crickets and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Hazel, sensing the calm, drifted over and stood beside him, her warm flank pressing against his leg. Jonas reached for her, fingers curling into her mane, and let the weight of the past days settle. He did not need to be strong, not now. He did not need to hold back the tears that threatened again, not out of sadness, but in the stunned, trembling joy of having something precious returned. Hazel turned, dark eyes finding his, and for the briefest moment, Jonas saw himself reflected. Older, yes, but not so alone. In that quiet, on the porch with Hazel at his side, Jonas understood something simple and true. That survival is more than endurance. That healing is more than repair. It is the willingness to reach out, to trust, and to remain when it would be easier to run. Hazel's recovery was not just her own, it was his too. The night deepened, cool and fragrant, and Jonas let himself lean into the silence. He pressed his cheek to Hazel's neck, feeling her breath stir his hair, and finally let go. Not of the memory of loss, but of the belief that he must always bear it alone. Spring spilled slowly into summer, folding green over the patchwork brown of the fields. The world around Jonas seemed to warm by increments, as if the earth itself was testing the idea of hope, inch by careful inch. Days stretched longer, sunlight honey-thick on the porch railings, and the sharp edge of grief softened in the mild air. It was not happiness that Jonas felt, at least not the loud, ringing kind he remembered from years past, but rather a gentle, almost invisible contentment that grew from routine and the company of another being who asked nothing more than presence. The farm remained modest, its list of chores unending and its fortunes unchanged. But Jonas found himself meeting each day with a steadier breath. There was the satisfaction of doing small things well, mending the sagging fence by the orchard, replanting a row of wildflowers beneath the kitchen window, sanding the old swing until its seat was smooth enough for bare legs. Hazel watched him work, sometimes ambling close enough to inspect the proceedings, her brown muzzle snuffling at the tools and bits of twine. In the early evenings, when the sky began to pale and the heat of the day leached from the boards of the porch, Jonas would settle on the steps with a battered book or a faded letter in his lap. Hazel often joined him, settling her long body in the patch of clover just beyond his reach. Sometimes, after a day's labor, he'd stretch his legs and let his hands rest in his lap, the book forgotten, listening to the steady rhythm of Hazel chewing and the far-off rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. He read old letters sometimes, words written in hands now gone from the world, a neighbor's quick scrawl about a barn dance long ago, his wife's flowing script full of grocery lists and quiet I love yous tucked between instructions for peach pie. These were not the kind of memories that made him ache anymore. They were simply part of the fabric of his days, threads of a tapestry faded but not torn. Hazel became as much a part of this tapestry as any memory. She followed Jonas through his rounds, shadowing him from the gate to the pasture, waiting by the barn door each evening as he tidied up the tack and fed the chickens. She no longer startled at sudden noises or kept a careful distance. Now, she allowed Jonas to drape his arm over her sturdy neck, let him brush the dust from her coat, and check her hooves for stones. Their trust grown so familiar it was almost unremarkable. Some afternoons, when the weather was warm and the air full of the hum of cicadas, Jonas would settle with Hazel beneath the shade of the old willow near the pond. He'd bring a pocketful of sugar cubes, offering them one at a time, his palm flat and steady. Hazel accepted each with gentle, deliberate care, her lips brushing his skin, her eyes half closed in contentment. It was under this willow tree that Jonas sometimes drifted into a light sleep, his head resting against Hazel's side, the two of them a study in companionable stillness. When he woke, there was always a moment, a thin gold sliver of time, where he forgot he'd ever been alone. He'd watch Hazel graze nearby, tail flicking at flies, and feel a sense of belonging so quiet it was almost like breathing. The farm was no richer, no less battered by the passage of years. The work was the same, patching roofs, trimming hedges, stacking firewood for the next winter. Yet Jonas moved through these tasks with a steadier gait, shoulders less bowed. He sang sometimes a rough tune from his childhood, or a fragment of a lullaby, his voice mingling with the wind and the low whicker of Hazel from the yard. Twilight brought a kind of soft celebration, not of achievement, but of endurance and simple joys. Jonas might light the old lantern and sit on the porch, Hazel nearby, the two of them watching the last swallows dip and wheel against the darkening sky. He'd speak, if at all, in half-sentences and sighs, letting his meaning settle between them without need for reply. Sometimes Jonas would find himself reaching for Hazel without thinking, his hand closing gently around her mane, his thumb tracing the scar that marked her as survivor. There was comfort in that. The knowledge that wounds could heal, that the world could give back in small ways what it had once taken away. One evening, as the last gold faded from the horizon, Jonas pulled an old letter from his pocket. A note from his son, written years ago in a careful, earnest hand. He read it slowly, aloud, Hazel's ears flicking at the sound. When he finished, he folded the letter and slipped it back inside his shirt, then leaned into Hazel's warmth and let the quiet hold him. The days were neither triumphant nor tragic. They were simply full, each one stitched to the next with habits and kindness, and the silent promise that neither Jonas nor Hazel would be left behind again. The days ripened into a kind of gentle abundance. Wildflowers tangled along the fence line, scattering their colors in careless, joyful patches. The orchard, thin from years of drought, managed a late flush of white blossoms, petals drifting onto the kitchen stoop like slow, fragrant snow. Jonas moved through this new season with a steadiness he'd nearly forgotten, a way of belonging to his own life that was quiet, grateful, and unhurried. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he first noticed the small figure lingering by the end of his driveway. He'd been stacking split wood by the barn, Hazel cropping grass nearby, both of them at ease in the sleepy heat. The child appeared as a shape, thin, unsure, framed by sunlight and the wavering haze that rolled up from the dirt road. Jonas wiped his hands on his jeans, eyes narrowed against the glare, and watched as the girl inched closer, hesitating just beyond the open gate. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, all elbows and knees, her hair a wild tangle under a sun-bleached ball cap. He recognized her in a distant, neighborly way, one of the Russell kids from down the road, the quiet one who always clung to her mother's side at the feed store, eyes wide and solemn, words slow to come. Now she stood alone, biting her lip, one hand curled tight around the strap of her backpack. Hazel was the first to approach, hooves soft on the grass. She paused a few feet from the girl, head low, eyes gentle. The child stiffened, shrinking into herself, but Hazel waited, patient and still, making no move to close the gap. Jonas watched from the porch, heart tugged by a memory he couldn't quite name, of a different small hand in his, a different summer, a different kind of hope. He moved slowly, careful not to startle either child or horse, and knelt a short distance away beneath the shade of the old sycamore. He didn't call out, didn't ask questions, simply let his presence settle, solid, unhurried, as reliable as the tree's deep roots. Hazel shifted her weight, snorted softly, and lowered her nose until it nearly brushed the girl's shoe. For a long while, nothing happened. The world shrank to the triangle of child, horse, and man. Three beings marked by old hurts, all wary of asking for too much. The breeze played with the brim of the girl's hat. Jonas drew a slow breath and looked up at the sky, watching clouds drift like sheep along the horizon. At last, the child let her hand drop, fingers hovering just above Hazel's mane. Her shoulders tensed, her breath quickened. But she didn't pull away when Hazel nosed closer, warm breath fanning over her knuckles. The first touch was light as thistledown, barely more than a brush, but in it was a world of courage, a leap across invisible distances. Jonas felt something settle inside him, a quiet pride that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with witnessing a moment of trust. He glanced at Hazel, who stood perfectly still, ears flicking forward, her dark eyes wide and kind. They sat together for a while, saying nothing. The afternoon slid into early evening, the orchard filling with gold. The girl's breathing slowed, the tension in her frame loosening as Hazel pressed her forehead gently into her palm. Jonas remembered teaching his son how to feed an apple to an old pony, remembered the shyness and wonder in that first contact. He let the memory wash over him, not as sorrow, but as a gift, proof that tenderness could return, even when one had learned to expect only loss. When the girl finally looked up, there was a new steadiness in her eyes. Jonas smiled, a small, careful thing, and motioned toward the porch. Together they walked back, Hazel trailing behind like a promise kept. Inside, Jonas rummaged through the old sideboard and found the radio, a battered thing with a dial that stuck and an antenna patched with tape. He set it on the porch rail, twisted the knob, and let a faint, crackling melody drift into the cooling air. The girl sat cross-legged on the top step, Hazel at her side, both listening with the stillness of those who know the value of quiet. Jonas poured lemonade into thick, chipped glasses and placed one beside her. She accepted it without a word, cradling the cool glass in both hands. Hazel nuzzled her shoulder, earning a brief, delighted giggle. A sound so light and unexpected it startled Jonas nearly as much as it did the girl herself. As the sun slipped lower, painting everything in copper and rose, Jonas watched the two of them, the girl and Hazel, bask in the ordinary miracle of company. He felt gratitude stir in his chest, not for second chances, grand or dramatic, but for the small, unnoticed ones. A neighbor's child brave enough to reach out, a horse who waited, a home that made room for the lost and the lonely. They lingered together until the first stars blinked awake. Jonas switched off the radio, gathered up the empty glasses, and wished the girl good night with a gentle nod. She waved, a small, shy flutter, before slipping back down the drive, her steps lighter than when she had come. Hazel stayed beside Jonas on the porch, her warmth a steady comfort. He leaned into her, feeling the day's quiet goodness settle through him. The world had not grown any less uncertain. But now, with Hazel at his side and the memory of a child's laughter in his ears, Jonas felt the borders of his life expand, just enough to let hope back in. Summer waned, the sun swinging lower each afternoon, shadows stretching across the porch like old, beloved quilts. On the far side of the pasture, maples and cottonwoods began to smolder at their edges, a hint of gold and rust creeping into the green. Mornings brought a breath of chill, a silver dew that beaded on the grass, ghosting the fence posts and glinting from Hazel's dark, velvety back. Each day Jonas woke to these subtle changes, letting them settle in him the way quiet settles on a pond before dawn. Life on the farm had never been perfect. Never would be, Jonas suspected. But he found, in these measured days, a depth of peace that felt truer than any tidy happiness. There were still bills on the counter, creaks in the roof, aches in his knees. There were still absences, an empty chair at the table, his son's laughter echoing only in memory, a closet that held his wife's favorite sweater. But now, Jonas noticed, the ache of loss did not erase the present. Instead, it made the present more vivid, more necessary, each moment a thing to be gathered and tended with the same slow patience he had learned from loving Hazel. Most afternoons, Jonas took his coffee out onto the front steps and watched the day unspool. Sometimes Hazel would come stand beside him, her warm breath ruffling his shirt, her shadow thrown long over the porch boards. Sometimes she simply lay down nearby, legs tucked under, nose low, eyes half closed in contentment. In the distance, the fields shimmered, old gold and pale green, stitched together by rows of wild asters and the silver thread of the creek. There were still chores, weeding the new flower beds, mending a loose hinge, sweeping the porch clear of late summer leaves. Jonas did these tasks slowly, letting his mind wander, the steady rhythm of his movements soothing in its predictability. When he tired, he'd sink onto the steps and watch Hazel amble beneath the apple trees, flicking her tail at flies, occasionally breaking into a lazy trot that betrayed her growing strength. He marveled at the fullness of her form, the bright, alert look in her eyes, signs of healing that mirrored his own, quiet and ongoing. One afternoon, a flock of birds, blackbirds maybe or starlings, swept low across the yard, chattering and swirling like wind-blown leaves. Jonas stood still as they passed, feeling the pulse of life in their quick shadows, the memory of old journeys and new returns. He thought of all the times he'd turned away from grief, determined not to be marked by it, only to discover that grief, like love, would always find its way back home. He found himself, more often now, drawn to the old guitar in the parlor, a battered thing, its varnish worn thin where his wife's fingers once pressed the strings. He did not play, not yet. Instead, he'd dust it carefully, polish the neck, then set it gently in the sun beside the window. He liked the idea of its quiet waiting, the patience in its silence, as if the music lived in the hush itself. Sometimes Jonas reread old letters or pulled down a box of photographs, letting memory roll through the quiet house like a summer breeze. He did not rush the ache when it came. He let it move through him, a bittersweet tide, knowing now that sorrow and gratitude could share the same space, that to love and to have lost was to be marked in a way that asked only for tenderness. Hazel remained his steady companion through it all. She lay at his feet when he watched the dusk gather, her sides rising and falling in a rhythm that matched his own. He spoke to her sometimes, not expecting answers, simply grateful for the listening. He found himself saying thank you, not just to her, but to the world for offering him one more season, one more sunrise, one more chance to give and receive the small kindnesses that, in the end, meant everything. Late in the day, as the sun painted the fields with the last light of summer, Jonas would sit on the porch steps, Hazel beside him, and watch the shadows climb the hill. Sometimes, in those lingering minutes before nightfall, he found himself humming, soft, half-forgotten tunes that floated on the evening breeze. Hazel's ears would flick at the sound, and Jonas would smile, feeling something old and tight inside him loosen, just a little more. It was not a life of triumph, nor one without pain, but it was a life he had come to cherish, made up of ordinary miracles, like the brush of Hazel's nose against his palm, the laughter of a neighbor's child, the steady return of spring, and the patience of long, companionable silences. He realized, in the hush of another peaceful evening, that he was no longer waiting for something to fill the spaces left behind. Instead, he had learned to inhabit them, to let them breathe, to fill them gently with memory and presence, and the slow, steady work of being kind, both to others and to himself. Jonas leaned over, pressed his hand to Hazel's warm neck, and whispered words that weren't quite words, just a sound, a blessing, a gratitude that ran deeper than speech. She nudged him back, her dark eyes shining in the last gold of day. Above them, birds wheeled toward home, and the world turned softly, quietly, toward another season. There are things most precious in life, Jonas thought, that you see only when you slow down enough to listen. A breath, a gentle touch, a choice to stay, again and again. And so the day ended, not with fanfare but with peace, the quiet closing of one chapter and the silent promise of another, already beginning in the dark. Sometimes the world asks us not for grand gestures, but for the patience to simply stay, through hardship, heartbreak, and seasons that feel endless. Jonas and Hazel taught each other that even the most wounded hearts can mend, not through sudden miracles, but through small, daily acts of kindness and courage. In the quiet company of an old horse, Jonas discovered that real strength means allowing yourself to be seen and letting others be part of your healing. If this story has stirred something in you, a memory, a hope, or just a longing to slow down, share your thoughts below. How have moments of gentleness or connection changed your own life? Your words might be the comfort or reminder someone else needs today. Thank you for being here and for letting this quiet story find a place in your day.